For the uninitiated, could you just, I guess, briefly explain what exactly the Art Law Society is and how it differs from the Law Society?
Of course. So the whole idea came from my personal interest in art law and my previous interest in art history. And I found out that, or as I'm currently entering my second year of law, and I just found that the curriculum didn't really cater to my own personal interests. So art law is quite a broad range of law. It's not like contract law or tort, which is specified, but instead it takes elements of different, or it's essentially the application of different types of law in the art field, and it can include stuff like contract, which is very traditional, and that has existed kind of since like the beginning of trade in art. But ever since, let's say, like post 60s, especially in America, with the rise of contemporary art and art that is no longer kind of bound to a flat surface, there has been like a lot of crossover between art and law. Um, either, I mean, most commonly when people think about artists and law, there's this idea of restraint, the poor or like the lack of preservation and protection for artists by the legal system. But recently, there have been a lot of, how should I say, artists who use the law as a medium and engage and interact with lawyers in order to use, for example, like conceptual art to challenge the current state and status of law. And that's kind of what I'm interested in. And it's really wide, it's really quite wide and like quite broad what art law can include, because like I said before, it can include contract law, it can include intellectual property law, it can also include labor law. That's like when you think about large artists such as Jeff Koons, who use mass studios and employ a lot of assistants to actually like complete most of his work. The protection of those employees, that's kind of also a field that is discussed in art law. Other things can include human rights. So there are cases involving provenance and like stolen artworks, and the like it goes into a more moral discussion or like an ethical discussion of who should own what. There's discussions about museums, for example, the British Museum, and like lots of pressure for them to return stolen pieces of artwork. It can also include things like mummification, and that the display of mummies in museums, and um, how does that like protect bodily integrity. If you think about, I'm kind of like rambling just with
It's
everything
fine.
that's coming to mind, but if you think about places like Body World, where it may or may not be considered art, but kind of like uh, how does the law treat the human body? How does it value it? Um, there's also good discussion using law as a mode of defining art, because that's always been a very extensive philosophical question, is how do you define art? And one route of trying to define art has been through an investigation of how the law treats art, which tends to be really restrictive in comparison to the way that it is viewed by artists. And like that's when law comes into play. um, I think like the easiest way for me to kind of outline our interests is through the speakers that we have currently lined up. So the first speaker is this art historian named Joan Key, who was a practicing lawyer in New York for a while. And kind of the first thing that I spoke about how do artists, in her words, mess with the law? So that's kind of her field of interest. And she's going to be our first like introductory speaker. We also have this woman, Julie Zerbo, who was a lawyer, is currently a journalist, and she runs a website called or concerned about fashion law. And within fashion law, there's discussion about ownership, intellectual property, how do you protect fashion, but even within fashion, how do you like labor laws, if you think about unethical mode of production, that kind of plays into it, although it might be harder to kind of categorize it as art law, but we kind of believe, or like I believe that it is something that should be included, hence why we're bringing her in. And we also have this professor, Professor Andina, and she, her talk will be about what I mentioned earlier, about how can, like, how is art defined philosophically speaking, and how is art defined by the law, and using the law as a mode of defining art. Yeah, that's kind of a brief overview. Yeah.
Cool. So you mentioned a few talkers that you're having in to give speeches, presumably virtually. Is that
Mhm.
kind of what Art Law Society does? Are those the events that you put on, kind of getting speakers in, or do you put on any sort of more discussion-based events or anything that isn't just having a speaker come in?
That's a great question. So the current plan, and term cards will be coming out hopefully by the end of this week. It'll be shared on our Facebook page, so Society for Art Law. So the first 4 weeks, we have speakers lined up, and then the following 4 weeks, we're planning on having discussion groups where we kind of send out reading lists, and the discussion groups, or like the topics, will kind of parallel the previous speakers. So we'll provide recordings of the speakers, and also provide some key cases, or summaries that we could find of the key cases, if people find that they aren't able to, find the time to read for that week. The meetings will begin with a brief overview of what the cases were. It could also be articles, and like chapters from books. So the treasurer, when we were discussing this yesterday, give me 1 second. So one of the, or like our first discussion kind of topic, in the 5th week, so once the speakers have all gone, will be subversions, so questioning how artists use the law as a medium, and contrary to popular belief, how are artists empowered by the law? Is the empowerment inherent or subversive? And how have artists challenged the law productively and therefore engendering change? So there is a book written by the speaker, Joan Key, called Models of Integrity. But there's also, my treasurer, who I was speaking to, told me about a chapter of The Art of Cruelty, which also talks about the use of art as, like, by artists, or the use of law by artists as a mode of empowerment. So we'll try to include chapters of books, articles, cases, what we find, and yeah, the following 4 weeks will be more discussion based. Also, so since we're just starting out, we're kind of considering Michaelmas as our soft opening, just trying to generate interest, get people aware of what is happening. And I think having the speakers in the beginning will be a great way of doing that, just because it's such a unfamiliar territory. Like, a lot of people that I've spoken to about art law, the immediate question is like, what is art law? How do you define it? And most of the time it's quite difficult to, because of how broad it is, and kind of just showing people the different applications of it initially, and then allowing people to have some sort of foundation that they can gain interest in. And I think it'll be really great because it is like, because it is so broad, it's possible to appeal to such a wide market, or like a wide audience. Like the second week, we're going to talk about technology and art law, and how technology has completely kind of changed the landscape. So lots of like pre-existing questions about ownership of artistic works, with the development of AI and AI generated art, that's kind of created a new path of inquiry. And yeah, like I was actually speaking to someone involved in Ox AI, and I think in the following term they have a couple, I'm not sure if it's a week or at least like a couple events related to the use of AI in art. So there's a whole nother audience that could be reached through that. In future events or future speaker events or panels, our plan for the future is to organize panels, especially when hopefully post-corona we can meet in person. There'll be discussions about like housing rights for artists, because especially in metropolitan areas, it's difficult for artists to find areas to live with affordable rent, and looking at solutions that have been kind of that have or that are in place currently, looking at like sorry right of like people to rent land and stuff, and like things that would apply to artists more directly in their practical lives, and that could appeal to like Ruskin students. So first we're going to start with speakers, and then we'll have discussion groups, and in the future we plan on having broader panels, so that there is generally a forum for discussion, especially with academics and practicing artists, because most times you'll find that there's some sort of dissonance in their understanding of a very common topic, and we are really interested in kind of discovering that and looking at that intersection. And like I said before, Michaelmas is kind of more of a soft opening, and hopefully by Trinity we'll be able to work with some sponsors and organize social events as well. But our initial interest is to just get people aware of what art law is. And I think just like the field of interest is quite different to what is covered by the more specific, or like just the Law Society, the Oxford Law Society, most of the time, or like most events tend to be more geared towards employment and like future careers, whereas this is more just open exploration, open to anyone. And we also don't want to restrict it to Oxford students either.
That's very interesting. Yeah, so that was actually going to be my next question. Is the Art Law Society only for law students, or is it geared towards everyone?
Yeah, absolutely not just for law students. So I'm the president, and the secretary, Evie Lang, so we're both lawyers, but the treasurer, Emily Wigater, she's a classicist. And that was such a great input for us to have, especially because within classics, she studied, or she did a paper on aesthetics. And they have such a interesting like relationship with exploring art that Evie and I can't explore through our degree, not at the moment. And I think just considering, like I mentioned before, the topics that will be discussed, I think it's open to a much broader audience. And definitely would not want to restrict this to law students or even people who are considering law. It would be great. Like, we want to appeal to artists. We want to appeal to people who are interested in going into tech, who are interested in kind of just anything that is related to production, and like looking at the way that definitions of certain ideas can change over time, and how like systems such as the law can interact with that, and how people can use the law to their advantage.
Cool. Well, that's pretty much all we've got time for. So you said that Art Law Society has a Facebook page. Is that where pressure should come to find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just getting started, and it's quite bare at the moment, but it's just called Society for Art Law. It's got a blue logo that says SAL. You should be able to find it if you look it up.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time.
All right, great.
And good luck with your events this term.
Thanks.